My name is Andrew Connell. I'll go through a little bio in just a second. In this session, we're going to go through a deep dive of the REST API, but I'm going to talk about two different aspects to it primarily. I'm going to do a quick little overview of REST 101, and then I'm going to go in and talk about batching with the REST API, and then I'm going to talk about using a client-side library called Breeze to make it easier in working with the REST API. I believe it was yesterday, might have been Monday, Todd Bleeker did a session about the REST API. Anybody go to that? Yep. So I'm sitting over here in the side. I keep hearing Todd say, Andrew's going to do this, and Andrew's going to show you this, and Andrew's going to show you this. And I think I'm sitting next to Waldeck, and as he keeps saying this, I'm looking at Waldeck going, I think I've got a half-day session now with all the stuff that Todd just said I was going to talk about. It's like, he didn't say Breeze, and he barely talked about batching. I'm like, what are you doing to me, Todd? So I saw him a few minutes ago, and he goes, yes, you're going to cover all the stuff I talked about, right? I'm like, no, I'm going to talk about what I plan on talking about. So I'm going to hopefully I cover a lot of that stuff, though. I'll have this link up at the end as well, at the very end of the session. You can grab the slides, you can grab all the demos I'm going to show you. It's all up there in a GitHub repository. If I click off too fast from it, go to github.com/Andrew Connell, and then you'll see a bunch of repositories that start with Prez, P-R-E-S dash. There's a way you can filter, and it's basically where I put all my presentations. It's pretty easy to find. The one that says REST and Breeze in it is the one you're looking for. Okay, so my name is Andrew Connell. You can find me online, Twitter. I got a blog as well. I'm also a co-host of a podcast called Microsoft Cloud Show that I co-host with Chris Johnson. We just talk about all kinds of all kinds of cloud-related stuff, not just the Microsoft Cloud. We talk about the competitive landscape as well. So if you're interested, go check that out. The other thing that I do a lot of is I do a lot of in-person and online training. So I teach for a company called Critical Path Training in the US. They come do classes here as well in London with the partner Combined Knowledge, who's the host of the conference. And then I also have a bunch of courses in an online provider called Pluralsight. One of them actually goes into this Breeze and REST stuff, and if you are a subscriber, you can go take a look at it, and if you're not, I've got a couple passes here. If you're interested, come up afterwards, and I can give that to you where you can take a look at that. All right, also have stuff on Angular and SharePoint as well, that one of my other sessions, just remiss in talking about that stuff earlier. So what are we going to go over? We're going to briefly go over the SharePoint REST API, because Todd did a lot of that stuff earlier this week, and if you want to see anything related to that API, then I'd recommend traveling back in time about 3 days and watching his session, or by just waiting for the video until it comes out. The Office 365 REST API is another one that I want to touch on. Then I'm going to talk about batching your requests for performance. It's not for the faint of heart. It's actually pretty tough to write the code to get that to work. There are some libraries that make it easier for you. And then I'm going to talk at the end about something called Breeze. Now, I'm going to just throw out there's a couple different ways you can get data in and out of SharePoint and Office 365 in SharePoint Online and Office 365 and on-prem. The two primary ways of doing it are using the client-side object model, the CSOM, or using the REST API. Traditionally, the CSOM has been the one that Microsoft has pretty much led with. That was the one that was more dominant in SharePoint 2010. And you could argue that it was also a pretty big focus for SharePoint 2013 with the amount of areas that they added to it. However, the REST API, in my mind, is what you should be betting on. I'm not a fan of the CSOM. There's nothing wrong with it. I prefer the REST API because it's an open standard. It has nothing to do specifically with Microsoft. I can use the responses that come back from the REST API with almost any library that's out there because they're just JSON responses and it's all standards-based stuff. Plus, when I'm looking for documentation on how to work with REST or how to work with specifically OData, which is Microsoft's implementation of the REST API, they use something called the OData protocol. There are a lot more samples and documentation out there of non-SharePoint samples than there are of SharePoint samples. They all work pretty much the same way in SharePoint's OData implementation. There's maybe like 1% of the things you stub your toe on saying, oh, well, SharePoint doesn't do that, or oh, 365 doesn't do that. But there's so few that I pretty much say that focus on the OData specification for doing all of your stuff. Don't go to the Microsoft documentation for it. Go to odata.org for all the stuff you're looking for around OData. So What I try to do is I try to find ways of how can I make my development life easier using the REST API. One of the challenges that we have with the REST API over the client-side object model, or vice versa, one of the things where the CSOM has won in the past over the REST API is the fact that you have a lot more plumbing code that you have to write when you do the REST API. You have a lot more plumbing code, and you also can't batch up your requests. But both of those things have been mitigated in SharePoint Online. The plumbing code stuff has even been mitigated in SharePoint 2013, and as of recently, SharePoint 2010 as well, and that's what the last thing we'll go into with Breeze. So let me just kind of briefly talk a little bit about the REST API for those of you who missed Todd's session or were not able, or were actually able to fall asleep with his presentation style, which that's almost impossible. That's a good thing. Todd's very energetic is what I mean. I'm not saying Todd's session is not a session you go to say, I'm going to take a nap in. That's not going to happen. So SharePoint, the REST API was introduced in SharePoint 2010. It was introduced as just reading and writing to SharePoint lists, just the list items, and working with data. We got to it by going to _VTI_bin/listdata.svc. The problem with that is that it was very narrow-minded. It only worked with SharePoint lists. What Microsoft did in SharePoint 2013, or in the V15 wave, is they really doubled down on it. It's no longer related to just SharePoint lists. There are tons of areas in SharePoint that you can take advantage of the REST API with where you used to use the CSOM. There are a few areas that you still have to use the CSOM because you cannot do stuff with the REST API. For instance, the big ones that come to mind for me that I always hit my foot on are workflow and taxonomy, or managed metadata. Those two are still not REST enabled. They are still only CSOM. All right. But I default to REST, and when I need those other things, I jump over and do CSOM stuff. Now, the other thing, too, that we got is that the endpoint changed to where it doesn't go to list data. It goes instead to just whatever site you're on /_API, which is much more conformant to the standards that we have out on the other sites that have APIs that you can take advantage of, going to a /API or /_API. So much more standards-based. When it shipped for SharePoint 2013, it was OData v3 compliant for the most part, for the vast most part. There's very few things that were not the same. And it was available both in SharePoint Online, which is in Office 365, and it was also available on-prem. And the parity was the exact same. You could do all the exact same stuff. However, late last year, we got a major update. Now, the update is not applied to SharePoint on-prem. It only applies to SharePoint Online. The major update we got is that now we can support OData v4. That's a new protocol standard, an updated protocol standard for RESTful services. And let me take a quick tangent real quick, because you hear these terms a lot, and make sure that you understand how all this fits in. REST is simply a practice. It's simply a pattern of how you do a service. Right? It just says, here's how the request is going to be sent, here's how the request is going to be responded to, but how you interact with it is up to each person's implementation. What OData is called the Open Data Protocol, and it's backed by Microsoft, but it's actually been developed with the consortium of a lot of different companies, like Microsoft, like Oracle, Sun at the time, IBM, SAP. And all these guys got together and said, what we really need is a common grammar so that we can speak the same language. So that we can, how do we select fields? How do we filter by things? How do we go order things? How should the requests look like when they're submitted? How should the responses go back? So basically saying, you will do REST, but you'll do it this way. And it basically sets us all up. It's basically saying, hey, look, there's a bunch of roads all out there, but we don't, and that's REST. We can do whatever we want with those roads, and you can implement them however you want. And every different district and parish and county and city and country can have different lines on the roads and do whatever they want with them. What OData says is, we all play by the same rules, so that if I know how to work with REST, I know how to work with an OData service, and someone says I have another OData service I want to work with, then I generally know how to talk to that service. Okay? So that's how the relationship between REST and OData. One of the things that this update that we got at the end of last year that gave us in SharePoint Online is the ability to do batching with our queries. And I'll show you more about that in just a few minutes. That's going to be our first demo that we run through. That's a huge improvement. And now the big hit that I used to get from all the CSOM lovers out there and say, oh, REST sucks because you can't do batching. I'm like, now I can. Right? So now we're in much better shape. So I'll show you how to get around that. We still got the plumbing problem, but we're going to solve that at the end of the session. So some of the reasons why you would want to consider why is REST better than CSOM. I used to have a picture that I'd play here, and it just had a sign up with a battlefield behind it that says, caution, religious wars ahead. I got dinged for saying that too much. It's like, I'm not saying that we're going on a crusade. You're reading too much into this. Anyway, try to put funny pictures and slides, and people get all bent out of shape sometimes. Like the two guys from the last 2 days that I've interacted with. Should have put those pictures. I really want to ask, are they in here today? But that's not going to happen. I will keep 2 water bottles reserved for them. So full control over the payload. When you do CSOM, CSOM's going to build up a payload to send over the wire to make it work for them, for Microsoft. That makes sense. It's their API, right? You would expect that. But when I go through and I'm working with REST, I have full control over the payload and what gets sent, and I have full control over how the payload comes back. With CSOM, I have some control over how the payload comes back, over what's in it. How it comes back, no control over that. Standard response types, it's JSON. JavaScript object notation. Basically a much easier way to read and write formatted data than what we've traditionally used, which is XML. And the big thing for me in the very end, consumers not limited to supporting technologies on specific platforms. You want to do CSOM? That's awesome. You need an SDK to use the CSOM. What SDKs are available? Well, we have things like .NET. We have things like Silverlight, right? Remember that thing? We used to have rounded corners on our UIs. That was really cool. And then we also have a JavaScript API that we can use as well. But what if you're working on a mobile platform like iOS or Android? Nope, sorry, SharePoint doesn't have an API for those, right? Or what if I want to use Java? Or what if I want to use PHP? God help you if you want to do that, but that's okay. Whatever you're using, right? It doesn't matter the technology, it doesn't matter the platform, it doesn't matter the developer experience. With REST, it's just standard HTTP requests and text coming back as JSON. And if you can interact with those things, you're good. And really, everything can do that today. So we're in good shape. Now, let's look at a couple different queries, what it looks like. Now, we're going to look at these because we're going to compare and contrast this towards the end of the session. So here, how do we get all items in a RESTful query? Well, this is using jQuery. So at the top there, I'm building up the URL. I'm using that really cool object that you get on every single page rendered by SharePoint. It's rendered on every single page. It's the _SP page context info object. It's a JavaScript object written to the page, and it's got a boatload of really good properties on it. So if you didn't know about that, open up your developer tools in the browser, go to a SharePoint site, open up the console at the bottom, type that in and hit enter, and then go, whoa, really cool stuff. One of them is the web absolute URL. Take me to the URL of the page of the site that I'm currently in. I'm going to tack on, I'm going to go to the list endpoint. So I look at the _API, look at the current SharePoint site that I'm in by going /web, look at his list collection, and then I'm going to use what's called an operator to say get by title. I'm looking for the contacts list, had to escape those single quotes in there. I'm looking at the items collection of all the items that are in there. And then on the query string, I'm going to say only give me back the first 4 fields, or the fields ID, first name, last name, which is actually title, and email, and sort them by the title field. If you want to sort in the opposite direction, there's ways to do that. The headers I'm going to use an accept header of application JSON /OData equals verbose. There are other options that you can use here to minimize the payload that comes back. I'm using this one because it's great for your developer or your debugging experience and see what's coming back. But you got to write your code in a different way if you use one of the other options. Like you can leave the OData verbose off. You can say OData equals minimal metadata. Different things like that. Those are all documented. You can do different ones in SharePoint Online, and if you do it on-prem, you have to have Service Pack 1 installed and then do some extra manual stuff to get it to work. Last but not least, we run the query. Right? Pretty simple stuff. Next up, how do I get a specific item? The only thing that you see that's different there is we're going to filter by this guy's last name equal to Connell. Right? So that way you'll get back a really cool object if you run this query. Right? Now, Next thing, creating an item. How do we do this? A little more work. The way REST works is that the description of the request that you're going to submit is telling the server what you're doing. So I'm going to say, I'm going to the collection of contacts that I have. So at the very top, you see I'm looking at the contacts list, and I'm going to his items collection. I then want to create a new item. And so what I'm going to do is build up an object right down here in the customer data part, right down here. I'm going to build up an object and convert it to a JSON string. And then down in the request at the bottom, you see where the type equals post. That's saying go post this data to that collection. And SharePoint's REST API says, oh, you want to add data to this collection. So it'll create a brand new item. The one thing you're going to have to do is that you're going to have to also add in this thing called the request digest, the x-request digest. That is how SharePoint is protecting itself from something called a cross-site forgery requests. When you log into SharePoint, traditionally, when you log into SharePoint, you're going to, you log in, you get a cookie added to on your browser. And every request you make, the cookie's sent along, and that says you're authenticated. Well, if someone else went through and ran some script on your machine and tried to write data to a SharePoint site, or update data, or delete data, every request that goes out is going to send that cookie along with it. So they're able to spoof acting like you from your machine, even though you don't see anything happening with the browser. So Microsoft does a thing here, and a lot of other sites do it as well, like Amazon does it too, where you use something to say this value inside of this hidden form value on the page must match something in the cookie. So you're saying that you must be making this request through a browser, and it's got to match something that's in the cookie. So you got to pass that along when you're doing anything other than an HTTP GET, okay? That's going to be true for updates and deletes. It does not apply if you're doing OAuth style authentication. If you're doing OAuth, there is no need for this because you have to go get an access token from a third party, Azure Active Directory, and then you send that across so that you've already identified who you are, you're not spoofing anybody. So there's no need for this access token. This digest. This was funny because I just learned that you didn't need this like in the last 2 weeks or something. So we're talking to the engineers, and I'm like, hey, this isn't working. Is this a bug? And he's like, yeah, you've never needed that. I'm like, what? It's like, you've never needed that. And I'm like, since when? He's like, since we started doing OAuth authentication. I'm like, why? He's like, because of this. And I'm like, oh, that makes sense. He's like, you didn't know that? I'm like, well, no, it's always worked before, so I never removed it. He's like, why not? I'm like, man, I'm like the guy that goes to the doctor. This hurts. Well, when does it hurt? When I touch it. Well, stop touching it. All right. Why didn't you remove it? Because it's working. Well, why don't you just try this? I'm like, what? I try to break my app? Why? I don't get paid for that. That's what the users do. That's what they pay me to fix the problems they do. The other thing you gotta do down there at the bottom, you can see where the content type is equal to JSON. I gotta tell it, are you sending me JSON or are you sending me XML? Well, I'm sending you JSON. That's the customer data object. Updates are the exact same thing, except I'm gonna point to no, that's the wrong code. At the very top there where it says items, it should say items and then parentheses the ID of the item that I want to update. I want to do a post to that specific item, okay? The next thing, what about deleting an item? This one, there's a little bit, deleting and updating have one characteristic where you can use this thing called if match. Todd talked about that earlier this week. You want to set, the if match is saying, does the version on the server match the version that I'm updating? If you're updating an item, you want to make sure that you pass in a specific value there. If you're deleting an item, then do you really care if you're updating an old or an updated item? No, generally no, you just want to delete it, right? If you're updating an item, you might just be a jerk and say, if match equals anything, just update it. Last one in wins. But that's up to you. So that's a REST, SharePoint REST fire hose refresh from what Todd talked about, all right? Now let me talk really briefly here about the about the Office 365 REST API. At the SharePoint conference last year in March 2014, they announced a preview and then they shipped a public final version of the Office. Sorry, I shouldn't say final. They shipped the V1 version of the REST API at TechEd Europe in Barcelona in October, I think, of last year. Now, what they did with this is that what we see is that we can access things like everything in Exchange online. contacts, calendar, mail. We can get to things like files, like our OneDrive stuff. We can get there. We also have a sites endpoint, which is effectively the REST API for SharePoint. What these APIs are doing is they are implemented as OData v4 endpoints. They allow us to interact with Office 365 data that is not just SharePoint data, but Exchange data inside of our Office 365 tenants using the same style of authentication stuff. You're seeing more and more, a lot of this stuff, you're seeing a lot of other things improving in this area. You've seen since, I mean, it's kind of been pseudo-announced, but you can definitely see it if you go into Azure Active Directory and you go look at all the different scopes that are available to you. You can say, add access to my SharePoint sites and my lists, and all of a sudden, recently, search showed up too. So you can see it's still adding stuff there. REST is where you can tell they're investing. There are SDKs available. There are native SDKs for things like .NET, for iOS around the Office 365 APIs, for Android, for Xamarin, for Cordova. I'm blanking. There's also a JavaScript one, but the JavaScript one is not intended to be used for web stuff. It's intended to be used for the JavaScript style apps you can do with Windows 8 or 8.1 or 10 or 15 or 7.5, whatever version of Windows we're on. So all those different things. So these guys, I think, they're investing. We see a lot of stuff going on with this. So this is really cool. Okay, we see a lot of things we can do with this. So all the things I'm going to show you, we can take advantage of it with both SharePoint data and Office 365 data. Now I'll clarify where things work in different environments in just a minute. Okay, so now we're kind of at a level set here about talking about all the stuff with REST. So now let's look at two more things. Let's talk about batching and let's talk about Breeze. So first with batching. One of the challenges that we have around the REST API when it first came out with SharePoint is they didn't support batch. What does that mean? It means that every time I wanted to do something, it was a single request. So if you want to create 4 records, update 1, and then get the results back, that's 4 requests plus 1 plus 1. 6 individual requests back and forth to the server, right? With the CSOM, I could have done all of that in 1 request and 1 response. But I got 6 requests and 6 responses coming back when I'm doing REST. We don't have to do that anymore because OData has something called batch. But SharePoint did not support it when SharePoint 2013 came out. When the Office 365 APIs came out, they did support batching, and as of late last year, or early this year, batch is also now supported in SharePoint Online. This is not available today on-prem. I don't know when you're going to get it. Let's just say vNext. When's vNext coming? They put a blog post out earlier this week about it. I don't know. They haven't said anything about the futures of what's included in next vNext, so we're not going there. I'm talking specifically about batching for SharePoint Online, and we'll see when we get that kind of stuff going forward. Okay? So now, why do you want to consider doing this kind of stuff? It's going to make your app more responsive. I'll show you some of the samples in just a second. Let's see, I just said all this. Yes, I just said all that. Great. Now, so what does the impact look like? So here's a screenshot of Fiddler. I'm not showing you a live screenshot, a live demo of Fiddler because it's almost impossible to show a good demo of it because it gets so chatty. But what this is a sample that I'll show you in just a minute, and it allows you to toggle between using batch and not using batch. So this sample is available to you in the repository. So what it is that you'll see that all these requests that have the word drivers in them, all these requests, basically session number 22 and up. So 22 and up right there, and up, session 22 and up, those are all not using batch. So what are we doing? In the first 3 sessions, 1, 2, 3, I'm saying go create 2 drivers in this list and then go get the contents of the list so I can display it on the page. I gotta do that 3 times. Go create a record, create a user, create a driver, go get the list back. I'm gonna do that a couple times. You see that where I'm doing it 1, 2, 3 times all the way up to session number 10, right? All the way to session 10. Then on sessions 13 and 14, it looks like I'm doing probably updates. I think those are those are actually updates, right? Oh, not yet. Those are updates. And then the next few, I said, all right, now let's delete everything in the list. So we had 6 things we added, we updated 2 of them, we still have 6, and I said delete everything, and so it's got to run through sessions 16 through 22. Let's go delete each one of those individual items and go then get the contents of the list, of which there's none. That's pretty chatty, right? But here's what's cool. That same request to go create those items can be done in a single batch request. I can say, go do this, and then do this, and give me the response. And I can do that in one single batch request, and it will do all that work, and then it sends back one response. So the line 24 can effectively replace lines 1 through 3. Even more so, I can do the same thing with the deletes. I can run all of those deletes and get the contents back in that single request on line 28. In fact, I could have done lines 1 through 22 just one batch request if I wanted to. Okay? This is just showing you a couple different ways of doing it. The batches that you see in between these 25, 26, 27, that's me simulating the same thing I did up here in the UI at the top. All right? Make sense? This is the interactive part. Make sense? Okay. All right. So what does a batch request look like? All right, this is where I get to some of the bad news. The batch request is pretty gnarly to write. So basically what you do is you create this one request. It's a one big string that you're going to pass across. The batch request is going to include a couple things. It's going to include any gets, and it's also going to include anything called a change set. And a change set is anything that is a non-get. So inserts, updates, deletes, you can use patch, you can use put, post, delete. You can use all those different verbs. So what does the response look like? The response is going to be where I'm going to get a single response back, a batch response, and then that's going to contain multiple responses for each of the different things that I told it I wanted to do. It's going to have one response per change set that I submitted and one get response back as well. And all of it is one big payload, one big response that comes back, and then I got to parse it apart to get those little boxes in the middle. Now, in standard, one thing to keep in mind here, in standard batching with OData, in change sets, you're allowed to put multiple things in one change set, like multiple inserts and multiple deletes, multiple updates. You can put multiple things in a change set, and let me make sure I suck it in before you take that picture. You can put multiple things in a change set, and the entire change set is treated as an atomic transaction, except in SharePoint, because we don't do transactions. Well, we do if you consider each thing a transaction, then we're good. So in SharePoint, when you're doing the batching, you only really put one item in each change set. You can't do multiple ones. That's just a little footnote, okay? Let's see, is that the only thing I wanted to say on that one? I think so, yeah. So let's take a look at what this looks like, what the code looks like. So let me drop out of this and let me go over to the repository you guys have access to, which is my REST Breeze. And let me show you a couple files here. So where's the request light? So let me show you an easy way to read this first. Let's get rid of that. Yep. And let's make this bigger. Okay. So here's and that's the different updates that are coming to Sublime, if you'd like to see that. Let's get rid of all this other stuff. Get rid of that. Oh, didn't get the right one. Where's the file we just had? Open, recent, request light. You go away. Okay. So let's look at what this looks like. Here's what here's what you would have to build up in your JavaScript or in your C# or whatever code you're writing to go do a batch request. You're going to create a post, and that post is going to go to the _API endpoint, and you're going to put $batch on the end of it, space, and then the protocol you're using, HTTP:1.1, HTTP 1.1. I'm showing you the sample for SharePoint, but the same stuff applies to Office 365 REST APIs as well. I'm just pointing to _API. Their APIs have something like Outlook. Outlook.office365.com/API/v1.0/ you get the picture. It's something else. The next thing is I have to tell it the host that I'm coming from. So I'm coming from my tenant, which in this case here, I've just chosen the generic name of tenant. What do I want to get back? Anything. What's the origin? I don't really have to say that. The request digest, I should put that in there if I'm making any changes, unless I'm doing OAuth, it's not necessary. And then the content type has to be multi-part mixed, semicolon, boundary equals, and then a quoted string that starts with batch underscore and then something. It doesn't have to be a GUID like I have here. It can be anything you want, but GUID is kind of the easiest one for me to work with. Plus, it makes me feel like I'm in SharePoint because we have an abundance of GUIDs. Then I'm going to have to say, now let's start the batch. And so I'm going to start the batch on line 8, where I say dash dash batch underscore with the ID, and then everything that follows that is everything that's going to happen in this batch. So I'm going to have a content type is equal to, the next thing I need to do is I want to define a change set. So I'm going to define the change set by saying content type, multi-part mixed, boundary equals, same thing. Change set, and I put a GUID in there. I have to put these things are all required. I have to put the host. I have to tell it the complete size of this change set. So you're going to want to build that up first and then figure out the length of that string. And then I'm going to go through and say content transfer encoding is equal to binary. All right, so what's in the first change set? Here's the first change set right here. We're going to create a new driver for our list. So content type is HTTP. Content transfer encoding is binary. Got to say that as well, which is kind of weird because you think it's like, wait a minute, I just see text. Where's the binary stuff? Got to use binary. It's weird. You say, why? I say, I don't know, but it works, so I don't ask questions. Have you tried anything else? No. Why? Because it works. What happens if you do it? I don't know. Do it and tell me. Tweet it. I'll retweet you. So let's do the request. Post to that endpoint. Looks just like the ones we looked at a second ago. Got to make sure you put the protocol on the end. What data am I going to send you? data verbose. And then you need to put the data that you're going to submit, which is the name of a driver who recently switched teams and is really regretting it right now, I think. The next thing is let's do another change set. So that's one change set that I did, but you see I'm going to say, hey look, we got another thing we're going to add to this same change set. See up on line, you saw a second ago, up on line 14, I have the exact same line that's on line 23. You can only list one thing in each change set, but I'm saying I'm going to send you multiple things to do in the same change set. Each one has to be preceded by a change set. The first request is terminating on the blank line 22. I got to start it up again. So I'm doing it again. I'm adding another driver whose team change is actually turning out fairly well. And then I might have, and then I want to say, okay, we've added those two guys. Now let's go through and let's finish the change set by saying change dash dash change set underscore, put the GUID in there or whatever ID it is you have, and then say it's done by ending the string with dash dash. Now that change set is now done. Then I say, okay, I want to add something else to this batch request. Batch dash dash batch underscore GUID. That's line 34. The next few lines down to like 39 are basically saying, now go give me all the drivers. And then I'm all finished with the batch down there at the very end. Dash dash batch underscore GUID dash dash. That's what a request looks like. Now I say that's the light request. That's the light version of it. Why? Because naturally there's a heavy version. What's the heavy version? That's really what it looks like. That's really what you build out. So like there's the big one. There's the cookie that got submitted. Here's the refer that usually goes in there as well. Here's the request digest, all that extra stuff. Down here, I put in some other things. There's the full URL of the app that I was looking at. So in the repository, I gave you a light version, say, okay, what am I trying to build here? And then it's like, what is it really supposed to look like? It's like, that's what that's supposed to look like. So I just saved the request straight out to a text file so that you could take a look at it. What does the response look like? So let's look at the light response here. It says, okay, we got a response. Fantastic. Here's the content that's coming back. Notice it says the boundary is a batch response. And I also have, it also gives me back the request digest. Let's start the response up. Now remember, the first thing that we did was we created a new driver. So down here, it said on the first response that came back, it was a 201, which is a created. Here's the data I'm giving you back. You told me you accept everything, so I'm going to give it to you as XML. His E tag of this item is version 1. Here is the location on line 12 of the thing that I created. And then here's the XML representation of it. Where you see the ... that's the XML representation of Fernando Alonso, drives for McLaren now, as it lists inside the REST API, or as it lives inside the SharePoint list. So you see I get one response back from my change set right here. The batch starts up again. Here's the second driver that came back, Felipe Massa. And then here is the third response that came back, which I said I wanted to get a list of all the drivers. And I want them back in JSON format. So I'd have to parse that whole thing out. Okay? It's not too bad to build up. It's a lot of string concatenation. I have a sample that shows you how to do that. If in the repository that I give you guys, there is a project here. Let me show it to you running real quick. So this is going to be an Acon Dev Showcase. Oh, let's switch over into incognito mode so we don't save anything. Actually, 2 uses for incognito mode. There we go. Working on it, you always are. Let's come over here. Breeze REST batch sample. So if you do F5 on the sample I'm going to show you, this is what you get. Let's open up Chrome Tools. Let's go to the network. Gotta love red X's. That's something from Microsoft, so I don't care about it. So over here, we have nothing in our list. Get all teams. Oh, we do have things in our list. We have 2 guys. So we've already added the old Ferrari team. So these guys are on Ferrari. That's where they were 2 years ago. I'm with the times, don't worry. Add the Mercedes 2013 team. So I click on this, and we should see 2 things get run. This is the non-batching sample. And then I get the response back. Add the Red Bull team, 2 drivers, get the items back. Update the Ferrari guys. So when I hit update, we should see this change right here to being new drivers. Which they were new drivers. Oh, sorry, that was update teams to 2014. Yep, so I'm still in 2014, that's right. So it made those changes, and then at the very end, if I want to delete everything, it'll be doing 6 requests and then get them all back. But what if I do batching? Come over here, let's clear this out. Add the Ferrari team. It's 1 request that got sent across. See how much simpler that is, those round trips? It's a lot quicker. Add the next one, another batch. Add the next one, another batch. And there's data getting in there, if you can see. Update them. The page says batch not implemented. That's because the code says that, but it actually does implement it. And then there's the last part about deleting it all, and you can see all the response and headers from there. So what does the code look like that this does? How to build this guy up? You have different approaches of doing this. This is not how I would normally write the code. There's different ways of doing it. But I just give you one sample on the basic way of how to do it. If I come down here and find the spot where I'm building, add team drivers with batch. Okay, so add team drivers with batch. This sample uses knockout just for very simple data binding. It does everything inside of app.js, which is not how I would do it, but it keeps it very easy for you guys to take a look at and read. I'm passing in a JSON array of all the drivers I want to add, and now what I'm going to do is going to go start building up my request. You can see I'm doing things like creating a GUID for the batch. I'm creating an array for where I'm going to put all the contents in. I have a change set ID. I'm getting a reference to the URL, all that stuff, and now I'm going to start running through all the drivers. So let's go create the batch for all the drivers. You see I'm just doing standard concatenation stuff. There is a change set that I'm starting with. There's the content type. There's the transfer encoding, a blank line, HTTP post going to go the endpoint for all the drivers. There's the content type, blank line, write out the data you want to save, blank line, add it, go ahead and push on the end of the change set for this one and add it to my batch body. Once I've done all that, I'm then going to come down here and say, now let's go create the batch request. I have a list of all the different change sets I want to do. Now let's go create the body. So on line 196, I'm adding the batch start. I'm then going through and pushing on a content type for the change set that I want to do, because I'm doing each one of these as one. The content length is the length of the entire body that I just created. Then I'm going to add on the transfer encoding, a blank line, then I put the body of the batch, blank line, and come on farther down, and ta-da, we go run the code. Okay? Now, writing this up is fairly hairy. Let me throw a couple things on the table here. Writing this up by hand like that, you look at that and go, wow, that's a lot of stuff. Yes, you spend more time writing the code, you get performance in your application, you decide is it worth it. Now, the couple things that can help you. There's a library called Data.js that Microsoft had created as an open source library. A lot of things use it. They have support for batching. Now, Microsoft has said that their stuff works with data.js, but there are, and they have the test cases passed for data.js, but there's a guy out there who keeps posting to my blog, posting comments to my blog saying it doesn't work, and here's a GitHub repository, go check it out, go fix this. I'm like, I don't have time right now, but I just want to throw that out there just so you know. It may work, it may not work, I'm not really sure. The problem that we have is that the response that we're getting back, oh man, I closed it. Are you guys still open? You are. Batch response light. The problem that we have is that when you do a response, the OData spec says you should be getting something that delineates that this is the change set response for this specific change set ID. So just like the batch request is a batch filled with lots of change sets with each ID, the batch response is all the responses, but each response should match a specific change set, okay? In Microsoft's response, they don't include the change sets. That doesn't go exactly to spec, right? That's apparently why data.js is having a problem with it. However, with that being said, there is a library out there that I reference in the slides coming up, and it shows it gives you a link to a library that a Microsoft guy wrote that will makes batching easier to work with the REST API, building it up and parsing the responses as well. Okay? So you can do both. There's two different options that are out there. Okay, so that's batching, right? Everybody cool with batching? It's a lot to bite off, I get it, but hey, you're like, okay, conceptually, my point is for you to walk away going, conceptually, I get it, I know why I would want to use it, I may decide I don't want to use it, I have a code sample I can look at, I can see the benefit, blah, I'll make a decision if I want to use it later. Okay? That's my goal there. So if you don't like it, I don't really care. Don't come talk to me afterwards and do that again. Okay. Trying to head those off at the pass because after this, I'm done. I got all my stuff. I don't want to be, come on. There. Okay. Now, we've got batching done. More on batching. Understanding the batch requests. A lot of stuff I just went through. I wrote 2 really big blog posts about it back in January. Those are links to them. And then also down here, Steve Karan, I don't know if that's how you say it, but he's the one that wrote that library that makes it easy to do REST batching, not by hand, but using a JavaScript library. Okay, so you can go ahead and grab his link that does that. This should work with data.js. We'll get to the bottom of this. The guy that I've been talking to, the engineer, the big engineer that understands all this stuff at Microsoft, he's like, look, if it doesn't work with data.js, please let us know. We got to get this fixed. So I'm kind of like, it's not my library, isn't it yours? You test it? How about, here's the guy's GitHub repo. Why don't you guys go fix it? Why don't you guys talk instead of me being a game of telephone? But at any rate, apparently I'm the gatekeeper. Don't like that role unless there's a PO involved. All right, so now, so that's batching. All right, next thing, let's talk about Breeze. Now, how many of you have heard of Breeze, the JavaScript library, not the stuff in the outside? Yeah? Okay, so let me explain what this thing is. This thing is freaking epic. This thing is awesome. So, those of you who are C# or VB.NET developers and haven't taken your pills to switch to C# yet, we have that thing called Entity Framework we can use to talk to SQL databases or other databases, other data sources. Entity Framework is awesome. It's a great ORM to go get data. Someone's going, yeah, it writes stupid, nasty SQL queries. Like, that's fine. You can have prettier SQL queries. I'm going to get my job done and go sit on the beach faster than you. Okay? Is you can write code faster. You can build better you can build applications faster and be more productive with something like Entity Framework, and it gives you a lot of other features. Breeze is Entity Framework, but it's done in JavaScript to run in the client, right? So, right? Really cool stuff. Link style syntax to go get the data out of that source that you're going to talk to. All network calls are going to come back as asynchronous promises, which is what it should do when you're working in the client. You should be working with promises. You're going to query and navigate. You can query and navigate to related entities. So if you have a parent-child relationship, I can say, give me this company dot employees, and I can get all the employees from it. I can query locally with automatic client-side caching. This is so cool. If I go through and I'm on a master list, and I get a list of all these different drivers, and then I want to click on a driver and go to his details, if I've already got the data, and I'm doing this in the single-page app style application, I don't care if I'm using Angular or Knockout or whatever, I've got the data, right? Why go back to the server to go get that item again? You've got it. Here's what's cool. I'll show you, you know what? I'll show you the query in a second. It basically just says, go get me this item, and if you have it in the local cache, then go get it. Otherwise, go to the server and go get it for me. I don't care how you get it, just go get it for me. You know how to do the query. Client-side entity validation. Is it a null field? Does it support nulls? Is it a number? Is it an email address? A URL? Is it a date time field? Breeze, before you try to save the data, just like in Entity Framework where you do .save changes, those changes won't be saved. It'll throw an exception that you can trap and listen for to check to see if there's any data validation issues client-side before it gets over to server-side. And we have client-side change tracking, so I can do lots of changes to lots of items and do .save changes. Or maybe I said, you know what, I don't really feel like saving all these changes. I click reject, and it fires a function called reject changes, and all of them get dismissed, just like Entity Framework. It's modeled after Entity Framework. It works just like it, right? So the problem is it doesn't work with SharePoint right out of the box. But last year worked really hard with the guy, with the company behind it. That one worked really well. I worked really hard with a guy named Ward Bell, who's the author behind Breeze. If you don't know who Ward is, you've got to go look him up. You've got to do like a Google image search for Ward Bell. He is by far this is a bit of an opinion, the best dressed developer at a conference you will ever see. And I mean like eccentric. Like I'm sitting here trying to have a serious conversation with a guy that's got gold sequence pants on, a black leather shirt on with a fluffy jacket, a purple top hat, and gold glasses. I'm like, dude, I'm coding with Elvis. This is freaking epic. He's awesome. The thing is it doesn't work out of the box. Why? Because what Breeze can do is it's got a server and a client component to it. Well, if we're doing SharePoint development, we're doing it the way Microsoft wants us to do it today. We don't do server-side development in SharePoint, so we don't do it, all right? Instead, we're going to use only the client-side piece to it. That's cool. Breeze has got the ability to point to an OData endpoint and say, I can build up my entire entity model of the data that way. No problem at all, right? But then you go do that, and if anybody has any intimate knowledge of how the metadata endpoint for SharePoint's REST API works, you would know that the thing is gigantic and you don't really want to ask for it. So instead, we're going to define the metadata manually ourselves. I'll show you how to do that pretty easy. It's just like in Entity Framework where you say, add a new data context to my project. There's my database. I want that table, go generate. It generates the code. That's basically what you have to do. And it's not that bad. Another thing, too, is that SharePoint's REST API uses non-standard OData stuff. You should have heard the words that came out of Ward's mouth when he saw all these X dashes in the front of all these headers. X dash request digest, X dash merge method. Some of the complex data types that we have in SharePoint, some of those things aren't OData compliant, or they're not OData standards. They work, but Breeze is like, I have no idea what this stuff is. I have no idea how to deal with it. So what we did is did a demo. No, oh, man, we're jumping all over the place. Where am I? Okay, we're good. So what we did is that we built a thing called a data service adapter. Now, the way Breeze is set up is very much a pluggable system. So it's like, here's the Breeze core, here's the OData core that uses the Breeze core, here is a, and then you can talk straight to that. What we did is we built an extra SharePoint piece that went above it that said, we know how to go massage the request and the responses to send them down through the core so that it works with SharePoint pretty easy. So we have a SharePoint data service adapter that we built. This guy's free. He's up on GitHub. He is in a NuGet package. He's in a Bower package as well. Is out there out there. We've made a bunch of updates to him recently as well. Takes full control over the requests and responses. Here's the cool stuff. The stuff that we've added just recently, before just recently, so as of SharePoint conference last year, we can talk to SharePoint 2013 list, the 2013 list REST API. You can, and this is primarily intended to be used with the lists, with SharePoint lists. Okay, let me just say that. So we could talk to SharePoint 2013 both online and in Office 365. In the same domain, and well, that was the big thing. That was the big thing that we could do. As of just recently, you can now use it to work with SharePoint 2010 If you're still on SharePoint 2010, you can use it with the list data to SVC endpoint. You can use it with SharePoint 2013 on premises. You could have done that before, but we fixed some stuff. And SharePoint Online, and we fixed a couple nasty bugs that were a couple people were bumping on. There are a few things that we still can't do that we want to get done, but it's an open source project and we accept pull requests. So if you'd like to help, come on in. One thing we can't do is cross-domain. So if the service supports cores, Breeze will take care of it. If the service doesn't support cores, like if you have to use a thing called the SP request executor today, yeah, we don't take that into account. That's a really hard problem to solve with Breeze, and I'm not sure if I'm actually going to do that one or not. Another one that we have is there are some other REST API endpoints that we want to add better support for, like search, like the Office Graph, like Exchange APIs from Office 365, like the Files API, and all that stuff. We want to make sure that all those things work. We haven't tested against the Office 365 APIs, but we're getting there. You can go grab all that stuff. You see there's a link there to how you can go ahead and go grab this stuff. All right? Now, why should you care about this stuff? Because I'm going to show you the code. This is cool. So there's really nothing, the demo, running the demo is like, oh, so you're getting data and showing it on a page. I've done that before. So let me show you the actual code for this, where things get interesting. Come on, where is, oh, your full screen. And we are going to go with 2013. Okay, so, yeah, this is it. All right, is that code big enough for you guys in the back? Yes? Yes? Up. I love the thumbs up. Is it big enough? Does that mean bump it up, or is it good? Cool. All right, we're good. I interpreted that as we're good. We're good, okay. So, what do we need to do? There's a few things we have to do. We got to configure it, and then we got to initialize it, and then we can go ahead and go run it, all right? But before we do that, why don't we just cut to the plot, and let's see what's so cool about this. You remember those slides that I showed you earlier about how to go do a get all items, and we had to write that big query in like jQuery, right? Oh, no way, man. We're gonna let Mark Rackley keep doing that. Instead, we're gonna come over here. Oh, come on, that's fine. He likes it. Here's what we're gonna do instead. I'm gonna say, now we'll go back to the setup stuff in a second. I'm gonna say breeze.entityQuery.from the name of the data source. I'll show you where we get that, contact type.default resource name. I'm using a thing called entity manager. I could have put a .select and then put a string in there of a comma delimited list of all the items I want back. I can also say order by. I can put a filter in there for a where clause. I'll show you that in a minute. And then I say execute, and it returns back a promise. So I say .then, take the response you got back, and then I'm working with the data in lines 117 through 125 the exact same way I would if I was getting it through jQuery. But look at that query up there at the very top. I didn't write all the stuff about the endpoint. I didn't do the plumbing code that I had to write. I just wrote a query that's very similar to a link style query that I would have written in C#. What about getting one item? This is the thing that's so cool. This one says, hey, entity manager, go fetch by a specific key the collection contacts, look for the item number 1. And the last Boolean value there says yes. Check to see if your local store in the browser already has this item downloaded. And if it does, go ahead and return it. But if it does not, you know how to go to the server and get item number 1 from the contacts collection. So go do that for me. And when you give me the response of the data on line 134, also include on line 136 a little property that will tell me if you got the data from the server or from the client cache. That is epic. At least I thought it was epic. Your response does not imply that you agree with me. All right. Was it? Oh, there we go. I got one guy. Right. All right. So updating the item. What do I have? 5 minutes. Okay. So update the first item. Let's go first. Get the item in line 134. I got the item. Let's see. Next thing up. And once I have the item on line 149, I'm going to change his name. I'm then going to say entity manager.save changes, and then it's just going to go through and saves the changes. You're done. What about creating a new item? I'm going to create an entity like this. I'll give him a first name, last name, and an email address, and then I'll just say save my changes. Delete is a little funky. You go get the item where I'm getting the item right here. So all that first part, lines 174 to 179, that's just the same code for getting a specific item, or getting all the items. That last, line, not the one that's highlighted, the next one, line 181, that's the only part that's a little freaky here. You kind of say, go to the entity, go to this entity aspect, set them to deleted, and then you save your changes. But that's similar to how we do it in Entity Framework anyway. You like? Pretty cool? Yeah? You're not picking up on the interactive part of the session, guys. Okay, so how do we do it? 3 things we got to do. We got to configure, we got to create, and we got to init. We got a CCI. I was trying to make that somewhere of an R, so we could do a CCR for a really cool band, but that's okay. We're not going to do that. So first thing, we're going to configure Breeze. So I've already downloaded some NuGet packages. The first thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to go create a new thing called the data service adapter for SharePoint, and I'm going to say breeze.config, initialize the adapter instance. I'm initializing the property data service to use SharePoint OData, and then I put true on there because I don't remember what false does. The next thing, honest to God, I forget, but it works, so. Right? The next thing here is I have to say, how do I deal with the request digest? And there's a little method that hangs off of this, and internally the data service adapter says, hey, if I need the digest for any reason, would you tell me how to go get it? I'm like, yeah, you go get it like that. If I'm building like an Angular app and I'm building a big single page app, I don't do it this way. Instead, I have a timeout that says, go grab the request digest using the REST API for the context info of the site, parse that out, set a timeout for it to timeout every, like, less than the timeout that it does, and refresh that get. There's a really big sample in the demos you guys have in the repository that you can download. I'm not going to go through the sample, but there's a really bigger Angular app that uses this if you want to see it. Now, once we've gone through and we've initialized it, so we've got it all set up, we got to create the metadata store. So how does that work? This is essentially telling Breeze, giving it some information about what that data looks like that it's going to be getting from the REST API. So I'm going to create a new metadata store. I'm going to get a reference to this thing called the metadata helper. What that is something, it's an extra library that Breeze gives you to make it easier to create entities. It's included in the NuGet package. So I recommend you would get it. I've got some comments here to explain what's going on, but here on the add type piece, I'm creating a new function that's going to basically create a new type in the metadata store, but then it's going to do something else about a select. So check this out. What I'm going to do here on the add type, I'll explain what this thing does in a second. What I'm going to do right here, don't look at it. I'm going to add a type here. I'm going to add a type. His name is contacts. That should match the name of your list inside of SharePoint. So where I have there, the name is contacts. The default resource name is the unique part of the URL to the endpoint. So you notice I don't have the whole thing in there. I just have get by title / contacts because I know what the list API is for a site. Then I'm going to define the properties. If a property is not defined, if a property's data type is not defined, it is assumed to be string. So the first one is an ID. That's of type int32. First name and last name fields, those are required fields. You can't make those null. The email field is not only a required field, but I'm adding in a default validator that Breeze gives me called email address. So we use a regular expression to make sure that content is valid, right? Let's see, I'm running out of time, so we must hurry. So that guy, he will make sure that if I ever try and save the data and it's not a valid email, it'll throw an exception. The very thing, this thing down here, add default select, that is some really hard to read JavaScript that basically says, if you don't give me a select statement in the query, I will create a select statement using only the properties you define, so that if your list has 100 fields, I won't just say, give me all 100 fields. In the metadata, you only told me about 4, so I'm only going to get those 4. Did that make sense? If it didn't, I don't have time to go back, so we'll do that after the session. Last thing, initialize Breeze. So this is the last thing we have to do. First, get a reference to the contact that we just created, the contact entity. So I say contact type equals get by entity out of the metadata store, contacts. Now let's go create 2 things. We need a data service and we need our entity manager. You saw those in the queries. Or sorry, you saw the entity manager in the query. The data service is needed by the entity manager. The data service is going to say, where am I going to do all this work? That's the service name. Another thing you have to tell it is you have to override a default setting, which right now the data service will say, I will go to that endpoint and ask for his metadata endpoint to build up the metadata store. And you say, no, don't do that. I actually know what this Boolean means. On line 99, it says has server metadata, and you say, no, it doesn't. And it really does, but you're telling it, don't ask for it. We've just defined that in a metadata store we did a minute ago. Last but not least, let's create the entity manager. That's a new entity manager that we're going to give it the data service that we just defined and the metadata store. And now we can go through and start using the data. Didn't say poof, we can use the data, Jeremy. Almost did. So there we go. That's all you need to do to get this to work. Now, you might look at that and say, wait, that was a lot of stuff. Everything from line 108 all the way up, all of this stuff is literally cookie cutter stuff that you can copy and paste into every project. The only things that you change are this function right here that's going to be for each entity that you want to go get, and the contact type you're getting a reference to. Other than that, nothing changes. So one of the things that we have that we're going to try and do with the adapter is to actually do more of this stuff for you. But for right now, you've got to do it. Right? So it's not that bad. The setup is really not that bad at all. Pretty cool? What if you want to do it with SharePoint 2010? The only difference with SharePoint 2010 is, aside from the service, the URL is going to be different. You're going to, where is it? It's right here. For some reason, the font is so much bigger in this one. Now it's so much smaller. There it is, the very top. Instead of saying SharePoint OData for the adapter instance you want, you say SharePoint OData 2010. And now it knows how to work with SharePoint 2010 stuff. Very simple for you to have to work with. The reason for that is internally there's some type names that are different. If any of you used this before and you're running into a problem where types and there was an extra S or there was a missing S in there, that's been fixed. Okay, that was the big fix that big thing that was driving us crazy. All right, so that's that. Let me jump back and, slides over here, and I'm going to get off the stage for the next guy. So you might, or girl, I'm not sure who's next, but anyway, so you might have been sitting through this entire demo or this entire session, and you're like, wow, that was really a deep dive. I have no idea what's going on. Other people might have gotten it, and you might feel like that guy right in the middle. That's okay. I've been in those sessions too. But you have the code, the samples, and everything, and you can go grab it, right? So thank you very much. Sorry I went a little bit over time. Thank you very much. And if you didn't like it, then just keep it to yourself.